Hey guys, Pastor Hank here. We're trying a different way of recording just because I couldn't get kind of our typical way to work. So hopefully it's not a distraction. Hopefully it sounds right and you can see everything just fine. But it's Pastor Hank. We're continuing on our message of the prophets. We're looking at week 2 of Ezekiel. We spent last week looking at the first couple chapters of Ezekiel, and this week we're going to look at the tail end of it. Before we get into that, I want to give you a quick update on Hudson, my Hudson update. This week, Hudson learned how to walk the dog, or rather, the dog learned how to walk him. I don't know. But my father-in-law used to train dogs for the military. And one of the things that he would do is whenever the dog would start running ahead of the trainer, that trainer would turn 180 degrees and start sprinting the other direction. And you can imagine that the dog would get choked pretty quick. But the hope was that the dog would learn not to go in front of the person, the trainer. Well, I think Ellie picked up on that and is doing the same thing with Hudson of... Whenever Hudson gets ahead of her, she turns about face and she goes the opposite direction. And poor little Hudson does all he can to hold on. But that's our little family. Hudson's doing great. He's going to turn 2 pretty soon. I appreciate you guys asking about him. It means a lot. It means a lot that you're thinking about him, praying about him. So he's about to turn 2, and we're excited for that. Well, as we said, we're going to continue in with Ezekiel, and I titled this one, Our Future Hope. As we've been talking about the gospel, we've looked at different stages and different parts of the gospel of justification and sanctification. And today what we're going to look at is a little bit of our glorification. What happens in the end? And then how does that change how we live today? Well, quickly thinking about Ezekiel, and a quick refresher on his life is Ezekiel is born in this time in between when Israel is taken into captivity, the northern 10 tribes, and when Judah, the southern 2 tribes, are taken into captivity. Ezekiel is in his 20s, mid to late 20s, whenever Babylon carts off this first group of exiles, and we think he's among the first of those people. And some of the other people in that group that you'll recognize that have been taken away are Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then also the king of Judah at the time are taken away as a way of discouraging the people from really starting an uprising. This is meant to suppress the culture and the people of a captive land, so Ezekiel is going to live through this period and eventually see the fall of Jerusalem. And what's interesting about Ezekiel is that he was a priest. He was supposed to be raised as a priest. He's of the priestly line, and so likely he saw his dad become a priest, and he saw his uncle and maybe probably his grandfather as priest, and probably a lot of his older male cousins become priests. And around age 25, it was his turn to start looking into becoming a priest. Around the age of 25 is when he would have started this internship, where he would start to learn the ins and outs of working in the temple as a priest. Well, around that time, though, is when he gets carted away and taken out of the land into Babylon. He leaves Jerusalem and is taken to Babylon when he's about 25. And where our story starts in the first couple chapters is when he's about 30 years old. Actually, it says in the 30th year, chapter 1, verse 1, which is when Ezekiel should have taken up this mantle as a priest. It's when he would have started working as a priest and taken ownership of the sacrifices and the rites and the upkeep of the temple and all these magnificent things that have been going on for centuries upon centuries in Judaism, instilling him as an important part of the culture and really giving him his purpose and his worth. But instead of that, he finds himself at the banks of the Kidron Canal, not in Jerusalem, not making sacrifices on behalf of the people, not interceding, not being a judge for them to help with any disputes that they have. None of these illustrious things that come with being a priest, or none of the things that maybe he expected, but instead is a farmer, likely, sitting on the banks of the canal in Babylon, not in Jerusalem. But it's here that God does something amazing, something that I would guess priests back in Jerusalem hadn't seen for generations, if ever at all. God shows up in an incredible way. You see, Ezekiel has this dust storm that comes, and he notices in this dust storm that it's unlike anything else. There's this presence there. There's this light coming from it, this majestic aura coming from this item in the dust storm, and it's what we would call a heavenly chariot or a heavenly throne or a mobile heavenly throne. And on it, Ezekiel goes on to describe this vision that he has. And he sees these angelic figures, each with 4 heads and 4 wings and legs like a human, but feet of that like a bovine, that their wings are touching and they are beside these wheels. And they're not just wheels, it says that they are wheels within wheels and that they're covered with eyes. And then as he continues to describe things, he gets more and more vague, but he says that on top of that, there's this throne, this majestic throne, but the one sitting on the throne is even more majestic. It is God's presence. And if I were Ezekiel, I'd be wondering, what's God's presence doing here? God's presence is supposed to be in Jerusalem. It's supposed to be in the temple. It's not supposed to be here. It's not supposed to be meeting us in Babylon. What's God doing outside the temple? What's God doing here? That's quite surprising, right? Well, as we check this out, we saw 3 points as Ezekiel is commissioned by God. One is that God shatters expectations. God showed up to Ezekiel in a way that he never expected. Not where he expected, not when he expected, not how he expected, and God commissioned him in a way that must have blown his mind. Again, Ezekiel is not in Jerusalem, where he expected to be used by God. He's in Babylon, but God is going to use him there. God shatters our expectations. As we think about our calling into ministry, it may not be exactly what we're expecting. It may not be when we're expecting, but we can see from the story that God's timing is absolutely perfect. Second is that God calls us, much like Ezekiel, to the people that are closest to us. And sometimes those are the hardest ones to minister to. God didn't call Ezekiel back to Jerusalem to warn the people of their sin. He called him to the people already in exile with him. He said that they're going to be a stubborn people, though, that they're not going to receive the message well, but Ezekiel is to be obedient to this calling, this commissioning that God has put on his life. And when we look at our own lives, we can think of what God has called us to. Christ called us to the Great Commission, which is to go and to make disciples of all nations and teaching them and baptizing them. But that word go really means as you're going about your daily life, as you are encountering the people around you, as you are fulfilling your daily duties, make disciples. We're definitely called to make disciples of those around us. Now, some of us have been called into other nations and other places. That's incredible. And some people are called that way, that God calls them, but we are certainly called to those that are around us. And those can be difficult. Because those closest to us know a few things that the general population don't, right? They might know some secrets that we have that we don't want people to know about. They might know our mistakes, our faults. They might be able to dig in when it really hurts, where it really hurts in our own lives. But God has called us to minister to them. As we talked about this last week, we were thinking through of perhaps you know of a child of your own, or a grandchild of your own, or a close friend or other family member that has taken a step away from God. We might call them prodigal, right? That they've gone away from God, or maybe they've never known God. They've never had a relationship with God, and they're walking in a way that doesn't please him, out of relationship with him. And we talked through that in these cases. I just wanted to give some encouragement is, let's follow the example that God gives Ezekiel. You see, God tells Ezekiel to be obedient to God's calling in his life. God tells us the same, is be obedient to the calling that he gives in your life. But he doesn't put the pressure on Ezekiel to transform these people. He never says that. He gives him the words to say, the objective, but he never tells Ezekiel to change the people's hearts. Other places in Ezekiel, we can see that God is the one that puts flesh on dry bones, that he brings the dead to life, that he takes a heart of stone and transforms it into a heart of flesh. That's not our job. That's not our duty. That is God's. Ours is just to be obedient to what God has commanded us to do, and that's to be deliverers of the good news, to be deliverers of his message, and then allow God to do the rest. When we think about prodigal children or prodigal family members or prodigal Christians, I want us to think that even though the prodigal son tries to disown the dad, in reality he was no less the father's son when he was eating out of a pigsty as he was when he was sitting right next to his father, right? He's still the father's son. And then second, for those that that maybe have never walked with God, that don't have a relationship with God, is we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves and say, well, if only we had a perfect youth group, if only we'd been in the church more, if only we had been a better example, if only we had been perfect. But think about this: is in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they walked with God and still decided to sin. Ultimately, these decisions are of the people. It is not on us. Even given the most perfect setting, Adam and Eve still fell away from God, and so how could we try to one up that situation, right? And then third, we saw that God gives us everything we need to keep going. When God commissions Ezekiel, he gives him a scroll, and it says that the scroll has woes and judgment on there, but for Ezekiel, it's sweet. God gives us the words to say. He gives us his very word, which is sweet, which we are to internalize, ingest, and it is good. Secondarily is that God tells Ezekiel that these people are going to have hard foreheads, he says, but I'm going to give you a hard forehead too. Meaning that he's not going to clear the path. He's not going to make this an easy message for people to hear. Instead of doing that, he's actually going to equip Ezekiel instead. And that is, again, what God does for us, is he equips us to deliver the message. I talked through that Hudson right now is really into a headbutting stage. He likes to headbutt people, and he can only do that if I let him close, right? God didn't promise that this would be an easy message, but God did say that he was going to equip us, give us everything that we need. Well, we're going to continue on with Ezekiel, and just to kind of summarize Ezekiel's message to the people is, if you ever hear about kind of a crazy prophet or crazy things that a prophet does, odds are better than not that it's Ezekiel that we're talking about. Ezekiel goes off to do some pretty radical things, but I somehow think that it's reflective of his personality. I think when I picture Ezekiel, I think of a guy that's kind of a drama kid, that is very much into the jazz and the show choir, and an actor. That's what I think of him, based off of how he's described in these, because he just does some really radical things here. So let's check him out really quick. One of his early messages is to draw the city of Jerusalem, and then to pretend that it's under siege. So one of his first messages is to go play army, right? He gets in the sand and maybe makes some sand castles that represent the temple and the entire kingdom of the entire city, and then he plays army, right? He sends in these soldiers to come in and take over the city and destroy it, and that was a message for the people that God is going to do the same thing with Jerusalem. Another time, he has to lay on his side for 390 days on one side of his body and then 40 on the other. Another time, God commands him to cook his food over dung. This poor guy that has to do all these things, right? This is what God's called him to do, though, so he's obedient and he does it. In Ezekiel 5, God calls him to shave off all of his hair, to burn a third of it, which I'm sure smelled awful, to chop up a third of it, and then to scatter a third of it into the winds. A strange message for the people. Ezekiel 12, he tells him to pack his bags and act as if he were moving out. And perhaps one of the hardest ones is in Ezekiel 24, God commands him not even to mourn the death of his wife. And God gives him this message, all these things, because it's a way of delivering the message of what's going to happen to Jerusalem. It's a way of delivering the same message that we've heard time and time again from these prophets, is repent, otherwise God's going to punish you. And he's not the only one that does weird things. Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 27, he's commanded to wear a yoke around his neck and to walk around town. In Isaiah chapter 20, he's commanded to walk around naked for 3 years. And so there's some other strange things that the prophets do, but I think this is certainly one of the top, right? So today what we're going to focus in on, though, is not those, but a later part of Ezekiel. And so we're going to really focus in on two different sections. One is a vision that Ezekiel has of the city of Jerusalem. We're going to look to see the detestable sin that's going on there. And then another part of it, we're going to look at the very end of the book, where he has a vision of what are the end times going to look like. All right. And so for us, first, I want to let's check out what is happening in the first part, whenever he sees this vision of Jerusalem. So I'm going to be reading part of it. Part of it will be up on the screen as well. Pardon me, I have to make sure I get on the right slide here. But okay, so God transports him into the city of Jerusalem in a vision, and it's described as in very similar aspects as this first vision that he has. He's actually going to see that throne again in this set of visions, but the whole point of this is to show Ezekiel the sin of Jerusalem. All right, so I'll read some of it for us, and then we'll talk about it. So we're going to start off in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 5. Then he said to me, "Son of man, lift up your eyes now towards the north." So I lifted up my eyes towards the north, and behold, north of the altar gate in the entrance was the image of jealousy. This is some kind of idol. We don't really know what it is. There's no more description of it there, but it's something that has brought God into jealousy. We know that God is not one to have divided attention. It isn't all or nothing. He says, "Have nothing before me." And so the people have set up something that makes God jealous. Verse 6, and he said to me, "Son of man, do you see what they're doing? The abominations that the house of Israel are committing here to drive me far away from the sanctuary. You will see greater abominations." God is saying here is these abominations are taking him away from his temple. Now, whenever the first temple was built and whenever the tabernacle was completed, there was this physical representation of God going into the tabernacle and into the temple. The people, as they were worshiping and having this grand party, they could actually see the presence of God going into the sanctuary or into the temple and into the tabernacle. There was this Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was, where there were two cherubim, and above that was this presence of God. That's where he was supposed to be. But here something is happening. It's talking about the sin of the people actually driving God away from his sanctuary, from the place where he was supposed to supposedly dwell in the temple. And that's because this is the problem of sin, is that God cannot be in the presence of sin. A holy God cannot be in the same place as sin. They can't coexist. And so when these people are sinning like this, God says that they are driving him far from his sanctuary. But it gets even worse. We'll skip on to verse 10. And there, engraved on the wall all around, was every form of creeping thing and loathsome beasts and all the idols of the house of Israel. And before them stood 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. Then he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen that the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of pictures? For they say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." What's going on here is that these elders of Israel in their secret rooms, in their private rooms, they have created these idols, these places to worship the creepy things, the loathsome beasts, and all the other idols of Israel. These creepy things and the loathsome beasts, these are things that are unclean. These are things that God, that are not only things in nature that shouldn't take the place of God, but they're the opposite. They are the unclean things. They are the things that God detests, and yet those things that God detests, they have made idols out of. And they're worshiping them in secret. Perhaps in public, they're saying that the Lord is with them, that they are following the Lord, but it's in their secret place where they think that no one is seeing them, that they're devoting themselves to these unwholesome things, saying that the Lord doesn't see us. He's even forsaken the land. He's not here anyway, so why does he mind? I'm going to go a little further. Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat a woman weeping for Tammuz. Then he said to me, "Have you seen this, O son of man? You will see still greater abominations than these." Tammuz was a Sumerian god of vegetation. And the way that this myth goes is that this Sumerian god dies and becomes the god of the underworld. Tammuz's followers would weep in the fall to symbolize when he dies, and then have a celebration in the spring to celebrate when he comes back to life. Here these people are putting their trust in the god of fertility, not the living God for their sustenance, their food, their viability. They put the trust in their longevity, not into the real God, but into the false God. They're no longer trusting God to provide for them, but instead it's something else. And then the last piece of this, I didn't get a slide in here for this, but the worst, the pinnacle of this abomination comes in verse 16 through 18, and you can read this for yourself. It says, "And he brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and behold, at the entrance of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, worshiping the sun toward the east. Then he said to me, Have you seen these things, O son of man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to commit the abominations that they commit here, that they should fill the land with violence and provoke me still further to anger?" What's happening here is these men are gathering together right outside the temple. And instead of going in and worshiping the living God, the God who has made and sustains all of creation, the living God who was, is, and will be, the one who is the Alpha and the Omega, instead of worshiping that God, the only one who is worthy of our praise, the only one who pre-existed and will go into eternity, the one that knows all and sees all and is all powerful, instead of going in and worshiping that God, they get right to the entrance, they turn 180 degrees, and they worship the sun, part of his creation. That's the epitome of this worship, literally turning their backs on God to worship something else. So what we see, our first point that we're going to talk about here from chapter 8 is that corrupt worship replaces and relativizes God. God, in this case, has become an accessory, no longer an obsession. See, God calls for us to worship him and him alone, to put him as number one. He doesn't compete for number one. He is what defines us. When we think about our identity is first found in him, not to be tacked on to who we are. He doesn't become part of our bio description. He doesn't become a hobby of ours. He doesn't become something that we do. He becomes all that we are, all that we need. He becomes our obsession. He becomes the one that we yearn for, the one that we think about. He becomes our culture. He becomes one who is great, not something secondary. Relativize, what I mean by that is he is not dependent, right? Relative means that it's dependent on something. Might be dependent on how I feel that day. If they felt like waking up and going to church, or if they felt like waking up and obeying the word of God, or if another offer came around. If as their day went on, it was convenient for them to follow the rules of God, or if in their own minds they thought a different idea was even better. Relative in saying that that I only follow God when it's convenient for me. That it's like that God can be like a keychain that I put on my key rings, something that's with me, something I depend on when I need it, but is certainly not absolute. And that is the corrupt worship that we see here. Corrupt worship is not about a method or a style, but about the wrong God. See, what they've done is they've domesticated and compromised and synchronized God. And as I think about this, we're not tempted with the same idols. We're not going around worshiping Tammuz or things like that, but parallels can certainly make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. We don't set up Asherah poles as they did, but if our devotion is drawn to anyone or anything, we provoke God to jealousy. We don't worship snakes, but things that are unclean, I think we do. As I was personally sitting and working on this, I have to allow this to transform me too. Rustin will talk about this from time to time, is that that God does a transformation in the speaker if he willingly submits to this, right? And the same is true of me this week. And I ask myself, what are the things that are unclean that I let into my own life? What's a compromise that I've taken on to say that it's okay right now? Is that I don't have to follow God's rule entirely. I'll make it okay. Well, I was thinking about a movie that was coming out recently that I was very excited to see. I was stoked to see it. It was a director that I was very excited for. It was on a topic that I was really interested in. It's has a big advertising budget, and it just seemed like it was going to be a great movie to go see. My friends were on board to go see it, and but somebody came up to me and said that there was the sex scene in it. Made them feel very uncomfortable. So when I heard that, I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I made a plan. I was going to see it with my guy friends. We were going to hold each other accountable. Whenever that scene came up, we'd either close our eyes or we wouldn't look, or we'd look at each other or something like that, or we'd fidget with our popcorn, whatever. And these are the group of guys that we check in on each other on these things and hold each other accountable. And I knew we were going to have a conversation about it afterward, and so I felt okay about seeing it, and God convicted me of that. okay with sin, okay with allowing things that are unclean in. I don't think God has room for when we make a plan to make the unclean things okay in our life. Well, what about something else? What about maybe these fertility cults that they have, where in order for there to be a good crop is that maybe a farmer would sleep with a priestess and his wife with a priest. Do we worship fertility cults? No, but I think love in itself, yes, we do worship. Isn't that the epitome of our culture? Is that all you need is love? Is that love is the most important thing? Is that in order to feel accomplished, successful, in order to feel worthy of anything, we need to feel love? I think love on its own has become an idol in our culture as well. Well, and what about this worship of the sun god? No, we probably don't worship a sun god, but creation over the creator, yeah, we're pretty guilty of that. I have a close friend that's a pastor in Colorado up in the mountains, and he talks about their biggest outreach opportunities. And it is that thousands upon thousands of people move out to Colorado year after year, hoping that the view of these most majestic mountains, these scenic sunsets, these incredible slopes, the beauty of the nature around them, they're hoping that in that they will find a sense of fulfillment, that they'll feel good about themselves after that, is that all their questions in life will be answered just as soon as they find that perfect trail to hike at the perfect time and get the perfect picture and live this perfect lifestyle. And he says that the reason why it is such a big outreach opportunity is because 2, 3, 4, 20 years later, people realize that it's not, that they have spent their lives committed to worshiping creation over the creator, hoping to find purpose and restoration from the creation over the creator, and it has failed them. Well, let's bring it a little closer, is that we have Sedona, not too far away, right? And I'm sure you guys have heard time and time again of a comparison of this, of people worshiping the creation in Sedona, going there to get the perfect view, again, of this most majestic place, but mistaking the creation for the creator. Well, let's bring it even closer home. What about us in Phoenix and Scottsdale? We live here in the valley. It's 115 right now. I don't think we see the sun as an object to be worshipped. We probably actually see it more of a curse than something to be worshipped. But maybe something that we associate with the sun, we do. I think of, when I think of the sun, I think of this association that we have with vacation, pleasure, suntan, the perfect day of golf, a cool drink in our hand while we float in a pool, the perfect scenic sunset or peak of a mountain on a perfect height. As we think about idols in our lives, I think some of those maybe take root. Some of those are probably things that we are guilty of. A description of who we are instead of actually being the one who defines us, that's, I believe, what we're guilty of. God's a jealous God, though, and he's not going to stand for being in second place. At the end of this section in the vision that Ezekiel sees this majestic chariot again, and that he saw from his very first vision in chapter 1 through 3. He sees the presence of the God of God, though, is now leaving the temple, leaving Jerusalem, showing that what is about to happen in Jerusalem is not because God's been defeated. It's not because God is weaker than the gods of Babylon. It is not that Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians despite God's attempt to save it, but it's rather destroyed because God is allowing it. Well, there's chapter 8 for us. And now I want to look forward to the other passage that we have for today of chapter 40 through 48. And a couple things happen in between that, again, are pictures of salvation, pictures of this new life that we have. And if you'll remember, whenever we talk about prophets, is that they have this job of looking almost at a mountain range of mountains face on from a far distances. It can be hard to tell what mountains are close at hand and which ones are further back. And so I want us to think of that as we think of Ezekiel's message, is that there are some things that are applied for the people at the time and at the day, of course, and but it would be fair to say that perhaps a fulfillment, a complete fulfillment of those messages are in things to come, either through Christ Jesus or in the times to come. And I believe chapters 40 through 48 falls in that category of distance that is still to come. But before we get there, I just want to remind us of some of the things that Ezekiel would talk about in this restoration message that he gives to the people. He gives the people a message of restoration. Two of them that you know, that you're familiar with. One of them is the valley of the dry bones. Ezekiel sees this vast valley of desolate, depleted, dead bones. And as he's having a conversation with God, something incredible happens. These bones start to come together, and cartilage begins to form, and they become beings, human beings. But at some state, they're just almost these empty shells of a person. And it isn't until God breathes in them that they come to life, reminding us, going all the way back to Genesis, where God breathes the breath of life into Adam, right? That he is this pinnacle of creation, that he is made in God's image, that he has the breath, the spirit inside of him, and it brings him to life. And for Ezekiel, it has two reminders. One, for the immediate, that yes, these people, these Israelites are going to be restored, that even though that they are a valley of dry bones right now, God is going to bring them back together. But looking even further ahead towards Christ, it is a picture of the spiritual life that we are to have, that God will bring the spiritually dead to life as well, that his spirit will live inside of them, that the Holy Spirit will indwell them and bring them to life. A second picture that we get of this is that God says that he will take this heart of stone and transform it into a heart of flesh. This heart of stone that is unable to follow God's desire, his will, unable to love God as he has called them to, and he will do the work of transforming that into a heart of flesh, a heart that is capable of loving, a heart that does desire to do the work and the things of God. And all this, again, as we talked about last week, falls in the category of things that God will do. It's not on us to bring the dead to life. It's not on us to transform the heart of stone into a heart of flesh. Those are the things that God will do. Well, now let's get into a little further into Ezekiel. And as we do, there's a lot of passages here. There's 8 chapters or 9 chapters that we're not going to be able to go over, but I do want to reference a few of them. And so in the first chapter of this, chapter 40, what we see is that Ezekiel gets swept up in another vision. And in it, this figure tells him that he is supposed to tell everyone of what he sees. And he's going to describe to him this temple being rebuilt. And in chapter 40, he's commissioned, he's told to go look at the temple of what's being built there. And then in the very next chapter, chapter 42, we get a description of the rooms for the priests, that God is going to reestablish some of these rooms for the priests, rooms for eating and sacrifices and robing and disrobing. It lays out that the new temple is going to have everything necessary for the priests to maintain their holy status, to remain clean. If you look at chapter 43, we see that the glory of God returns. And remember, as we said back earlier, after chapter 8, when God shows Ezekiel all the detestable things that are going on in Jerusalem, that his presence is taken out, well, now the presence of God, the glory of God, is going to return to this place. The altar is restored as well. This is the place to make sacrifices, sin offerings. The items used to remain in good standings with the covenant is brought back to the people, enabling them, empowering them to have a relationship with God. In chapter 44, the priesthood is ceremoniously restored. The rules are reestablished of who can be a priest, and the lines are redrawn of only those that are of the pure lineage can be in this position as a priest. They are empowered again. And 45, the role of the king is restored. It is the role of the king to uphold justice, not violence, to use correct, not false scales, and not to have crooked deals. Again, what was happening in this place where Babylonians are squeezing out the people in the power of Judah is that their rulers, their religious leaders, their political leaders were creating crooked deals. They were turning a blind eye to evil things in order to further their own gains. But God says here that there's no longer going to be crooked deals. to actually enact the justice that God has called for. That's what the king is going to do here. The king is given a proper way to measure, to weigh amounts of precious metals and currencies, and God reestablishes these sacrifices that the king is going to make. He tells him both how to uphold justice with the people around him, and then he also shows him how to uphold righteousness, as in a relationship between the king and himself. And then in these last two chapters there, in chapters 37 or 47 and 48, we see that that God recreates these boundaries of the land and reestablishes them using precise lines and measurements. And then in 48, we get the allotments for all of the tribes. And then at the very end of this city, this grand city, it's revealed the name of the city is that the Lord is there. So our next point as we check this out is I want us just to contrast that description of the new city, this city that is called the Lord is there, where the temple is, where the people are doing what they're supposed to, where the king is enacting the way that he is supposed to, where the priests are doing everything that they are supposed to, where proper sacrifices are being made, and contrast that with chapter 8. Well, as we look at chapters 40 through 48, just something I want to bring up is it's kind of confusing about what these chapters mean. If Ezekiel is looking into the future, does that mean that one day we're going to be getting that Israel was expecting a temple that could do all these things? Well, maybe, probably not. There's some other strange things in here, such as like a small trickle that comes out of the temple that eventually flows into this river that goes into the Dead Sea that makes that sea fresh. We don't see that really happening. If you go to the Dead Sea, it's still dead. So it's probably not just a literal interpretation of what's to come, although another temple was built, but in a much smaller scale than this. And I don't want to put it just as a symbol of this Christian life, of the time of Christ and until the second coming. I think to do that robs it of a lot of meaning, and it's very confusing because there's a lot of Old Testament symbols in here, and what is that doing in this New Testament where we really only have one rite that we hold to, and that's communion? So what are the sacrifices and priests and all that doing there? So I don't think it's just for Christians and on this side of the cross either. I think it's maybe a little bit of both, of this prophetic apocalyptic interpretation where if you look at some of these things that are established, these Old Testament laws that are finally being completed, finally put in the right way, is maybe a way to think of this is in the same way that Ezekiel had to kind of like loosely describe what he saw in chapters 1 and 3 with these angels with 4 heads and like the wheels within wheels, and it's kind of confusing and it doesn't really make sense, but Ezekiel's doing his best job to take like what he knows and describe these angelic, heavenly ideas and concepts within the framework of what he knows. I think the same thing is happening here. I think Ezekiel is that God is helping Ezekiel see what is to come in the New Testament and in the age that is to come by using Old Testament verbiage, by using what he knows as a priest to describe something that is heavenly that he probably doesn't have a box for, right? So what does all of that mean? What does chapters 40 through 48 mean? It is a people that are finally able to obey and love God the way that he asks, the way that he commands. These chapters are full of people's identity being restored. It's people whose purpose is restored. It's people whose role, whose walk of life is restored. It's people that are doing the thing that God asks them to do. They are being restored. And in this, you can get some cool pictures of what does that restoration look like. If you look in Ezekiel, you'll see cool imagery that goes back to the Garden of Eden when man was with God in the first place, because in both of them there's this river and there's trees growing with fruit all the time, and these leaves are meant for healing, and we see lots of imagery of that in Genesis chapter 2. And so we get the idea of restoration, of God bringing things back to the way that they were supposed to be originally. God restoring people's purpose, restoring unity, a relationship with him. So again, the question is, how does that relate to what we saw in Jerusalem in the earlier chapters? Well, we see in the earlier chapters that Jerusalem is in a broken world, and that they become subject to the culture that's around them. So our second point here is, as I look at this, is I see that in a broken world, worship is bound to be countercultural. Is that when we contrast these two, they couldn't be further apart, right? That's because they're living in different realities. In one of them, there is this obsession with the world that is around them, of the creation. And then in the other, there is an obsession with the creator, of being in right relationship, of doing everything he asks to do because he has enabled them to do it. And in this, we see the name of the city is that God is there. Contrasted with chapter 8, where we see that the presence of God, or chapter 11, 8 through 11, where we see the presence of God leaving them because they're sinful. He says, I don't want to be part of this anymore, and they are driving me away from my sanctuary. In a broken world, worship is going to be different than the culture around us. Who are we to say that that we are going to be in a different setting, that our culture is going to be honoring and worshipful to God? It's not. Our worship to God should be countercultural. It should cause others to scratch their heads and say, what are you doing? This doesn't make any sense. It's going to look very different. Our culture tells us to worship the things just like they did in chapter 8. Our world tells us to worship ourselves, to worship the unclean, to worship love, and to put our own comfort, and to put the well-being of the joy of a vacation, the joy of retirement, the joy of not doing anything, the joy of just being comfortable as number one, but it's not. Our singular obsession should be with God's presence. And we see with this obsession is just a depth to the worship there, right? Is we can see Ezekiel, the end of Ezekiel, being picked up again later. Later we see that there is no king right now in Israel. The people eventually go back into Israel. The temple is rebuilt, but there's no Davidic king yet. And we're left with pages upon pages of hundreds of years of silence until something happens. In the first pages of the New Testament, it opens with, here's where Jesus Christ came from. The son of David, the son of Abraham. A king is being restored. And then we see in further books along this that Jesus says that if you destroy this temple, that I will rebuild it in 3 days, and it'll be even better. And John opens his testament of the life of Jesus and says, the word of God became flesh and tabernacled, dwelt, entered into a relationship with us. And then to go with this idea of a depth of relationship, the last vision that we have in Scripture of John, it's that he says he sees a new Jerusalem, and it's shone with the glory of God, and that his servants there will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. In Ezekiel, only those with the name of God on their forehead will be spared, and this is the fulfillment there. There's not going to be a sun or a moon because they will see his face. Even the highest order of angels can't look at God here, and the only ones who can see God's image are his image bearers, so transformed to see his face and live, for indeed God is there. Revelation concludes this way. It says that I don't see a temple because the Lord and the Lamb are the temple. When we draw close to God, this God, his presence is inescapable. All that we will be able to do is to worship. It'll be wonderful to see those that we've lost, those that have passed away before us. We always say that the Christian goodbye isn't the final goodbye, right? Those that have passed away will be there, and they'll have new resurrected bodies. We'll have new resurrected bodies. I'll have a full head of hair, and there's going to be no more pain or tears or suffering, and we'll be in the presence of, and there will be the perfection of creation, but all those aren't the end goal. These are all secondary. These are all effects of the number one thing, a singular obsession with God's presence. As we see in chapters 40 through 48, they know the rules of God. They know what God has asked them to do. They know as expected, contrasting Ezekiel chapter 8 and contrasting so many of the other prophets where it says that they don't know who God is. They don't know what God wants of them, and so they're unable to worship him. But here we see that a deep relationship with God leads to a deep expression of worship. So after looking at Ezekiel today, what are we going to do about it? Well, we can immediately see two big ideas to pull when contrasting these two visions that we've been talking about. One, corrupt worship relativizes God, and genuine true worship will be countercultural. And last, we see this direct correlation between knowing God and true worship. Obviously, in chapter 8, as we saw the other prophets, the people don't know God. They don't know what he wants. They don't know what he thinks. They don't know what he expects. Contrasting that with the people at the end, those whose purpose is restored, those whose identity is restored, those who know what God wants and are doing exactly as he has commanded them, who are able to worship God. And eventually, in the end, we see even further fulfillment where there is no temple because the Lamb is there. There's not even need for a sun or the moon because God's presence is so magnificent. This old passage in Ezekiel, the law is given, it's followed to a T, and the depth of our worship seems to be directly related to the depth of our understanding of God. The more we know God, the more we trust God, and do what he and only he can do. The more we look to the relationship with the Creator as the most important thing in the highest order, the closest we get to this worship that we see in these final chapters. And so I believe a call for this message is maybe not so much intellectual knowledge, as these are strange, confusing chapters 40 through 48. There's a lot of discussion about what it means, but instead my hope is that we will begin to feel something a little different that drives us to live in a little different light. It's the simple call of Hebrews 1 that says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us fully examine our lives. Let us allow God to look at every corner of our life and ask him to say, God, reveal the idols in my life. Reveal where I have settled for comfort instead of growth. Reveal to me the places that I do not worship you. Reveal to me where you have commanded me to do something. Ask me to live in a way and I am not yet there. Reveal those things to me." And as Hebrews continues, let us run with perseverance the race marked out before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith.